Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Summit Bid podcast. My name is Kemper.
My name is Toby.
And we're going to talk about some, we got some interesting photo news, rumors and stuff.
We've got some interesting stuff coming out of Sony, and then some interesting personal camera news, some switching around of equipment, and then some big picture questions we're going to ask about medium format and
because
the future of the industry.
Fuji announced a camera. I don't know whether you've heard about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of getting buried underneath all of the
A1
hubbub, and it'll probably get reburied by the Sony's next thing.
Sony's next thing. But yeah, so before we jump into all of that, we would like to invite you to like this video if you kind of like this kind of content, this photography content, and kind of commentary on all of it, and then hit that subscribe button if you enjoy these photography videos, podcasts, and we do a lot of outdoor stuff too. So we try to keep it some variety.
And if you're listening on iTunes, you can also leave us a review on iTunes there. That's much appreciated as well.
We really do appreciate it. It helps our channel. We're actually, our growth has picked up quite a bit over the last several weeks, and we really appreciate that. And it does help us out. It helps YouTube, when you like something, when you subscribe, YouTube really shows it to more people. Like, we're seeing it in action. So
indeed. All right. So Sony's new announcement is the FX3.
FX3.
So we have the FX9, and then we have the FX6, and now we have the FX3. This is unprecedented. Sony's never released anything like this camera before. It also was not really rumored at all. It is a photo of the camera leaked out this morning by at Joe Lowery on Twitter, looks like. And he just has the camera, probably been using it for a while. I don't know if he's going to be in trouble with Sony because...
Well, they also have an actual product photo like that you would see on B&H. Mm-hmm. It looks like like an A6600 has been going to In-N-Out Burger too much.
Yeah, well, In-N-Out Burger and possibly spending a little too much time at the gym as well.
Oh, yeah, maybe so.
Because, this thing looks chunky and really, like, the only camera that you can compare this to in the past is the Sigma FP. This looks a lot more usable and potentially better built than that camera. So the question that immediately jumps to mind is how does this fit? I mean, Sony already had the A7S III, and then you could go from the A7S III to the FX9. The pricing structure there is about $3,500 for the S3, and it jumps all the way up to, I believe, like $6,000 on the nose for the FX6. So no one was really complaining about wanting a camera in the middle, but obviously Sony thought that was necessary.
Right. So with these cinema cameras, the lower number means lower features, higher number is better. Is that how it works?
Yes, and that seems to be something all of the industries kind of
with the cinema cameras. See, like, I feel like the A1 has thrown a wrench into everything because it was all building up where the higher number better for Sony. Mm-hmm. And then like now the A1 is back down at the very beginning. It's just strange. So now I'm like, oh, does this mean like, it's like with Canon and Nikon, the lower number has normally meant higher end. Right. So
at least on their higher end cameras anyway.
I mean, it would make sense looking at it. And then it says on Sony Alpha Rumors that it's going to be 3,795 euros, which is what in dollars? So like 4,500?
The exact translation is $4,601.63.
So probably 4,500. Yeah, 4,500.
Americans usually get a little bit of a break.
It may even be 4,000 straight up. Like sometimes they do that. So
yeah, who knows? So here's the question. It doesn't shoot 8K. That's already seemingly been confirmed for sure. But it does shoot 4K 120. What is the spec they put in this camera that still keeps the S3 relevant, but also gives this camera a spot? What would you say?
I have no idea. Like with this form factor, it definitely like it's going to rival the S3. It seems very strange to me, as this seems like it's going to I guess it's going to be more expensive than the S3. So I don't know all of the features. Like we really don't know all the features it's going to have.
We really know nothing except that it has CF Express A card slots, which is the same as
right,
S3.
The same as the S3. It has a flip screen, which the A1 doesn't have. It looks like it has the focus knob is on the top, which I find very interesting, that the focus point joystick. So that's kind of interesting. It's a really interesting designed camera. It's kind of nice to see a new design come out of Sony, because Sony has kind of been stuck in their design language now, it seems like for a while. So
yeah, I don't know if I would get too excited about it showing things coming for the stills line, because this has been built from the ground up by Sony's cinema line. It says it on the top, the naming structure and everything. And it has certain things, like it has 3.5 mil, basically like a tripod screw screw.
Oh yeah,
I'm not describing this very well. It's on the top, and let me see if it looks like
on the sides too. Yeah.
So this is built to be rigged out. So here's what I'm willing to maybe guess is it's basically an S3, but it shoots raw internal, because that would put it in a place in the lineup that would give it a real standout feature. 16-bit raw internal recording to the SD card.
Or the CF Express.
Or the CF Express card.
Is it A? Yes. Yeah.
And that really would set it apart, because you do have to use external recorders for pretty much everything else that shoots raw, except for the Sigma FP, which is what this seems like this was kind of released to compete with a little bit.
Right.
But honestly, this looks really exciting. It's still not really in the bracket that I'm looking in. So personally, probably not a camera I'm going to pick up. I actually just picked up a new camera. I got it in the mail yesterday, and we're shooting on it today.
We are shooting on it today, so we can't show it to you.
So, but we can show you the image anyway. I got the Z6 II.
Yep.
And I am kind of eating my words from a few months ago. I believe on this podcast, I said that the Z6 II was completely underwhelming, and I didn't really like the announcement very much.
Yeah.
It's maybe not the most impressive camera on a spec sheet that's ever been released. It actually still doesn't even have the 4K 60. They're going to put that in a firmware update hopefully this month.
Yeah, I think they said in the middle of February. So when they announced it, so like it seemed like it was a thought through thing. It's not something that So
in the autofocus seems to be very much improved over the Z6 I, just more reliable. Although the video autofocus was never a huge issue on the original Z6. It was more model eye detect autofocus, stuff like that.
Right, that makes sense. So, and tracking, right? I know that the original Z system, like the tracking was just not up to normal Nikon standards. And what's kind of funny is that Nikon's been known as the tracking company for a long time. Like their D series, their D6, D5, D4, they always like pretty much had the best autofocus, you know. So I think that was kind of a disappointment, but it seems like they're getting it back on track. So it sounds to me, can you kind of talk about kind of some of the big reasons you decided to move on from the EOS R to the Z6 II?
Yeah. So one of the things that was hitting me as a pain point was the no full frame 4K. I mean, to have it come down to something as simple and kind of obvious as full frame 4K is kind of sad, but that's a huge part of the equation. I had just purchased the 10 to 18 in order to get a wide 4K option.
Okay.
On the EOS R, because I was really getting kind of irritated with having to shoot a lot in 1080, and as we're looking at doing more and more video work potentially higher stakes video work. I just kind of wasn't super interested in shooting a ton of 1080 and mixing that together.
Okay.
And then on the other end of the spectrum, the slow motion, I don't need a lot of slow motion to be super happy. I'm not looking necessarily even for 4K 120 as a must have, but the EOS R shot 1080 in 60p and 720 in 120p. And that was starting to feel a little limiting. I used the EOS R for about 6 months or so, and an excellent tool. Even for video making, really usable, but I think that the image quality was finally grinding me down. And once I kind of got wide angle 4K again and was enjoying that sharpness and everything, I was kind of wanting that low light performance back. In wide angle 4K, wanting some of those features back. But I actually feel like I learned a lot from the EOS R. Specifically, I had kind of gone down this very prime heavy road with my A6600 and was using mostly primes, and that doesn't really work super well with a lot of what we do. It's something that I hope I can have zooms and primes in the future. I kind of have that going with the system with Nikon with the 21.8 and the 24 to 70 f4.
Okay, great.
So I've kind of got both. Kind of got some zoom and prime action going, but I hope to expand on that in the future. And then the last reason is I haven't been, beyond 8-bit 4K. I'm pretty satisfied with that for a lot of what we do. That's perfectly fine. But I am interested in exploring some higher quality images and just kind of learning how raw video works. I can now shoot raw video if I want to. It's got 10-bit as well in full frame, which was something I didn't have before. I could only shoot 10-bit and 4K with that big crop on the EOS R.
Okay,
so
right.
Some of those options.
Now, does it shoot
really
10-bit
nice
internally, or
it does not.
Okay, so it's just to an external recorder. Okay.
So interestingly enough, a camera I was really looking into was the Fujifilm X-T4 as the other option. Kind of was investigating that. And that does shoot 10-bit internal, but there was just too much autofocus drama with that camera for me to jump on it, particularly for video. I haven't heard nearly as much for stills. It's just kind of unreliable. It'll jump on the background, it'll jump on the foreground, and it won't necessarily stay.
Okay.
And to me, that's pretty much essential. I need it to just kind of sit on a talking head and not get distracted. So,
all right, that makes sense. Yeah.
No 10-bit internal. It's kind of sad, but who knows? Maybe they'll add in a firmware update. I also really like using the Ninja.
The Ninja 5. Yeah,
it's really fun. I experienced shooting that for the Maroon Bells video. If you kind of want to see the EOS R push to the absolute limits of what it's capable of, we released a Maroon Bells vlog where we went back in November and shot there.
Oh, right. Yes.
And I used the Ninja for most of that shoot, and I was really happy with how the footage kind of turned out from that, and particularly just it's a lot easier to compose with a giant screen like that. And
right. So what did you kind of sacrifice switching to the Z6 to?
Sacrifice the flip screen.
Right.
Probably sacrifice 10-bit internal recording, but I saved money on the deal. Yeah. So the R6 shoots 10-bit internal. I was really interested in looking at getting that camera, but the Z6 has a lot of overheating issues. Even external.
The Z6 does? The R6?
The R6 does.
R6 does. Okay.
The R6 has a lot of overheating issues. It's kind of legendary for all of that. And I really, even externally, it has overheating issues, and that's just kind of too far for me. Some of the stuff that we shoot, I need to be able to put the camera up and just leave it and not worry about it. And the R6 has enough overheating issues to kind of make it unapproachable, even though the 10-bit's really awesome. Being able to shoot 4K 10-bit internally is really cool.
Right.
I would rather be able to set my camera up in a way where I can shoot 10-bit unlimited as much as I can purchase storage for and keep the camera powered for is attractive to me.
Right. Well, and then the Z6 II is $500 cheaper than
It's $500 cheaper,
the
which
R6.
basically gets you a Ninja V. We already have one, so I didn't have to work that
Right.
into
Well,
the
but
budget.
you were able to get 2 lenses, 2 high quality. Like, and that's not something. You mean you had multiple lenses with the R6, but it wasn't nothing.
Yeah, with the EOS R.
With the EOS R. Sorry. Yeah.
the
You never had the
24
R6.
24 to 105 f4 was my lens before, so I am losing that 70 to 105 range. I can get that back with the DX crop, but I can't get as far out. One of the really cool things about the EOS R was being able to get out to like 180 millimeters in 4K.
Oh, that's true.
And I did enjoy that some, but getting footage really stable at that range is tricky on its own.
Right.
And
Well, and now you have the 21.8, which is a better lens than you ever had on the R system. And the R system doesn't really have an equivalent lens to that yet, which I think is really interesting. I feel like Canon kind of needs to fill in that gap pretty soon, because that's a very usable, important usable focal range. So
yeah, they don't even have a they don't even have a 24 prime at this point.
right, they just you can adapt over.
You can adapt over,
but you know that's its own thing.
Well, that's its own thing, and the EOS R itself didn't have IBIS.
Right.
Now, the
R6
R6
true.
does have IBIS. And what ended up kind of starting to happen is I had a certain budget, a specific budget, and this is going to happen to everyone when they're switching. You kind of have a certain amount of money you have, and you can add to that, but sometimes it's tricky because you have other things you're trying to save for. Maybe you can't add more to your budget.
Right.
There's really no way to do it. So I had kind of a specific budget, and I kind of wanted to go on ahead and make the move now before we got into a busier shooting season.
Right. Yeah. It's a little slower right now with what we're only able to get out like once every 2 to 3 weeks. And actually, on an interesting side note, the avalanche danger in Colorado has been actually very crazy right now. So that's partly why we haven't been able to get out into the mountains very much, because it's on the dangerous side for kind of where we were looking to go. You know, if you're resort skiing, you're probably not up against it too much, but like anyone who's into backcountry skiing or any of that, hiking, climbing, snowshoeing, which the snowshoeing, hiking, climbing is more what we do. It's not been super safe. So, we're hoping to get out in the next couple of weeks, maybe.
Yeah, for sure.
But, so it's just kind of been a very strange weather, in Colorado. There's a very weak snowpack, so you know it's kind of kept us inside, kept us working on other projects. So, yeah.
So the main, let's call it not exactly trade-off, but the R6 was pretty easy to disregard pretty quickly just because of some of those issues. I could not afford the R5. That just wouldn't work with my system and my budget right now. So what I kind of ended up needing to do is kind of looking at, okay, well, what can I get from Fuji? What can I get from Sony? What can I get from Nikon? Fuji has the autofocus problems, and the X-T4 is really the only choice for me. As much as I adore the spec sheet on the X-T4, I'm hoping to get a chance to use it at some point. It seems like a great camera, but the AF issues there, I really need to be able to rely on that.
Right. That makes sense.
AF.
Yeah.
So that kind of killed the Fuji idea. So then it came down to Sony or Nikon. And so right now, Sony's offerings within my budget line are the A7R III, which, okay, I'm paying a lot of money for megapixels I'm not going to use.
Right. Well, and then the video on that, like we've used the R3 for video, and it's just okay.
Yes, it's just okay. The A6600, which I came from, and the color on the Sonys, especially the older Sonys now, so the A6600, which is better than the A7 III, I feel like, but it still struggles with color shifts, purple shadows, in S-Log, things kind of going very primary color, and I need to be very careful with that because I'm colorblind. Now, the A7S III would have been awesome, but it's out of my budget.
Right. Yep. It's that notch more.
The A7C doesn't really give me any sort of video upgrade. I could have absolutely done the A7C.
Right. And you very seriously considered it.
Very seriously considered it. But the IBIS is about as good as the A7 III in it, which isn't amazing.
Right.
I don't get 4K 60, which was maybe not an absolute necessity, but it was definitely something I wanted, just to have that ability to shoot 4K 60.
Right.
And the main advantage of that camera is it was a squeak cheaper. It was a squeak cheaper, and it had the flip screen, fully articulating flip screen.
Right.
So right now, like having to make the switch right now without the A7 IV on the table, which who knows what the A7 IV is going to look like, but probably very comparable to maybe a little better than the Z6 II.
Right. What I see is the A7 IV having that the Z6 II doesn't is it might be able to do 10-bit internal. I look at that as possible. But I'm going to go out and step on a limb here and say I actually do not think the A7 IV is going to have a flip screen. And that's going to upset a lot of people, but I think it just makes sense from a Sony standpoint. They released the A7C, right? And it has a flip screen, and they're like, this is the camera for vloggers, for, all of this area. And then you have the S3, it has a flip screen. If you release the A7 IV and it has a flip screen too, like you make those two cameras, like you take a huge chunk out of both of those cameras for their value. You hit their value pretty hard. And I think they're already trying to figure out the value on the S3. I mean, even this new FX3, like it's if it's only $500 more than the S3, like
500 to 1,000,
right? 500 to 1,000 more than the S3, then like there's some interesting problems there for Sony as far as all that goes. So I think that the A7 III is going to have the exact same body as the R4, so no changes. It's going to look exactly like the R4. And Sony did that a little bit with the A1. It's the same body as the A9. So the A9 II, excuse me. So, I think that's kind of going to be, I think that the A7 IV is going to look a lot like the Z6 II. I think it may have 10-bit internal. It's probably going to have 4K 60 at launch. You won't have to wait for it.
It'll have no record limits.
It'll have that's another benefit.
So the thing about the Z6 II is that it's probably a little worse than the A7 IV, possibly a little cheaper than the A7 IV.
Right.
I could definitely see the A7 IV hitting 2,500. And they'll probably make it worth 2,500. They'll add stuff like 10-bit internal and some of these other features. And, how many recording modes it's going to have? Will it have all eye recording? Will it have some of these? How much of the S3 is going into the A7 IV is a huge question. But the A7 IV isn't out.
Right, that's the other thing, and we don't know. Everyone says it's close, but if you kind of flash back to the A7 III, like it was close for a long time. Like, so I remember when they announced the R3, everyone was convinced that was the announcement for the A7 III, and that would have been October. What was that? 2017? Yeah, October 2017. And everyone's like, oh, this is the A7 III announcement. And then it kind of leaked an hour or two before that, nope, this is the R3. And then the A7 III wasn't announced till the next April, and then actually in hands next June. So, more than 6 months later, people were actually using the A7 III. So, and I don't think Sony's in a hurry, honestly, with the A7 III.
I mean, the A7 IV.
I'm sorry, yes, the A7 IV. I don't see why they would be, especially with the A7C, I think, selling fairly well. And the A7 III is still selling well.
Well, and it holds its own better than it probably should, particularly for still shooters.
Right.
The video side is where Canon and Nikon have chipped away at it the most effectively.
Right.
On a spec sheet, which is, for a lot of people, they have to make decisions based off of a spec sheet.
Right.
They don't get to try out different cameras. And I did try the A7 III, and I didn't love that camera, to be entirely honest with you. Just the way that camera operated and the colors that came off of it and some of those things. I know I'm being controversial here, but I'm also being subjective. That's my opinion.
Right, exactly. Yeah, you may or may not like it. But another factor with the Z6 II is that it is very weather sealed and very durable. Nikon has really really done a great job with their Z cameras on making them very durable and reliable.
And that really did factor in to my decision making as well.
Right.
I really want to be able to leave my camera out confidently on the capture clip, even when it's raining. Because like on Huron, we got stuck in a very cinematic, epic storm. Kind of. It wasn't.
It would have been. Yeah. It wasn't. Yeah.
It wasn't lightning, but it was raining really hard, and the wind was blowing around. And I would have loved to have just put my microphone away and kept shooting through that segment. And that was with a Sony, the A6600 that I was using at that point.
Right.
And I just did not feel comfortable putting my Sony through that.
Right.
Maybe I'll eat my words and I'll destroy the Z6 II. But I think from my experience with the D500.
Right. Well, and then there's lots of videos out there of people taking their Z cameras into pretty extreme situations.
So and the very last thing is I'm really looking for a camera for 2021. Like at its baseline, I'm looking for a camera for this year. If the Z6 II blows me away and I'm able to use it for 2 to 3 years, that's awesome.
Right.
But really what I'm looking for is I'm like, well, my resources are going other places this year. I really want to get the best quality I can for the productions we're going to make this year. And I'm going to reevaluate next year once the A7 IV is out and readily available, assuming it is, of course. And Sony doesn't wait another year on that camera.
Plot twist.
I remember that the A7 III took forever to come out, forever and ever. So that we'll have to wait and see. But I'm also curious to see what Canon does. They have a bunch of cameras coming out. Fuji does. They might release the XH2 this year.
Oh yeah, and that could be really interesting.
That could be really interesting. I mean, even down to, if my budget could fit it, whatever this Sony FX3 is, and kind of giving it a year. But I really like the capabilities that I have. So I'm pleased with the Switch. Obviously, it is always kind of, you're opening yourself up to disappointment if the A7 IV gets announced next week and it's incredible. And $2,000. But
but you'll be able to, and also like, will the A7 IV have solved the color issues? Because I do feel like that Nikon's baseline color is better than Sony's. I don't think you can make that argument as much with the S3 and the A1 with some of the new modes that they have in it, and the color science. But I don't see all that being in the A7 IV. I think a lot of people, Sony's in a little bit of a lose-lose situation here because the hype, like they got this reputation now for giving, everything in a camera, right? And like, I feel like people are kind of setting themselves up for disappointment with the A7 IV because it's just, Sony can't. Like they can't make it almost, they have cannibalized to some degree, but the A7 IV can't really rival the S3 in the same way. They and then if it does, then that means that they have to give the S3 a long time to sell and get into the market, which means that the A7 IV is further out than what people are saying. So, and
that may have the spec sheet you want it to have,
right. It may have the exact spec sheet you're wanting to have, but it's not going to be till next spring, right? Like if you want the A7 IV to have a flip screen and 4K 120, it's probably not until a spring 2022 release. It's just not before then.
And is Sony going to focus on the still side of the A7 IV?
Right,
because the resolution, and kind of leave the video in a similar place to where it is now.
That's another factor to consider. Also, something else that they could do is that they could try to make a splash with the video on the A7 IV and make it shoot 6K, but not have any of the frame rate things and some of those that like an actual video maker kind of wants. But 6K would sell a lot of A7 IVs to people kind of in like kind of the A7 IV range. It's not a videographer's camera necessarily, so.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we should
probably move on.
But I'm very excited about the Nikon, and there will be videos coming out soon about more details on it, more footage from it for sure. So
cool.
Cool.
So our main topic that we're going to talk about, we're already a half hour in, so But it is kind of what we're going to talk about is that Fuji, right after the A1 was announced, and this was either really poor timing on Fuji's part, or I'm not sure.
Maybe really amazing timing. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it was a day after the A1 was announced, and we made that whole podcast and everything reacting to the A1. Fuji just kind of quietly announced the GFX 100S. And like I saw a headline about it on, news sites that I saw, and I'm like, oh, okay, that's interesting. But then, started looking at it more, and like, I've looked at the GFX 100 not seriously, but I've been like, wow, this camera's really cool. Like, it's medium format. It's the pinnacle for a landscape photographer. So of course I'm going to kind of know about it a little bit. And I start doing like research into the 100S. And I'm like, oh, wait, so you mean it has the same sensor, right? Yeah. And it has IBIS. Yep, it has IBIS. Takes the XT4 battery. Yep, it has RAW. It shoots video.
12-bit RAW.
12-bit RAW external video. Yep, just like the... and it's the size of an S1R. So it's smaller and lighter. And oh yes, it's $4,000 less than the GFX 100. And like my mind was kind of blown by this. Like, wait, what did Fuji just do? And I don't think we can kind of see how this is going to affect the industry yet. But it is affecting. We know that it's pre-selling at a rate that Fuji was not ready for at all. And
it's a very difficult to argue with spec sheet.
Right. And from all accounts, from firsthand accounts, like the autofocus is good. Obviously, it's not like an A9. So if you're comparing it to the A9, it's not like that. Or the new A1. But the autofocus is really good. It's a very stable, the IBIS is great. Like people are shooting handheld 100 megapixel shots with it. And so I think I'm wondering if, and I think the question that I kind of wanted to ask today was like, the A1 is kind of the hyped up camera right now, and the R5 and all of these, but is this GFX 100S actually the most important camera that's come out in a while? Like, is it going to change? And we won't know for a minute, but is this actually going to change the industry in a way that like almost like the original 5D did, right? Because that was when full frame became the thing, right? And then the 5D did it again with the Mark II with the video thing, but not going to get into all that. But
well, it kind of does do some of that though with the video side.
Yeah,
there's really never been a medium format camera except for the GFX 100 that had some of these video specs, and very respected videographers loved what they were able to do with the GFX 100.
Yeah, I think you mentioned Philip Bloom, who is
yes, Philip Bloom.
He's an enormously popular and respected YouTube videographer.
And he also worked with BBC for many years on a number of different documentaries, and very, very experienced. He loved the GFX 100, and this camera only builds on that with less overheating issues. And a number of other like tiny little details with the autofocus, etc. But it's also $4,000 less. It's it's just a little bit. It's about the same price as the FX6. Now I'm thinking about it.
What is the 100S?
The 100S.
Yes, the 100S. Yeah.
So granted, you're not getting 4K 60 out of this camera. You're not getting a lot of those high-end stuff, but if what you want is a meat and potatoes excellent image at 24p,
I mean, 12-bit RAW is more than meat and potatoes. Like that's really, you're doing a lot of cool stuff with that. Like it's not the high frame rate thing. And like I don't think that the high frame rate thing is a trend per se, but it definitely it already doesn't seem as important as it used to. Like there was a time, like I kind of look at when Peter McKinnon broke big, when 120 B-roll and 4K 60 and 120 B-roll suddenly seemed like, oh, this is a must-have. And the truth is that like I used it a little bit on the R5, but not.
Well, it has a look.
It has a look.
It has a look, and there's kind of nothing you can do to stop that. And there's limitations with lights flickering and being more difficult. That may be more specific to our work, but it's been very frustrating.
Right.
With some of the stuff that we do on the more corporate side of what we shoot.
Right. But curving back to the stills on this, like medium format, like when you really think about it, it's a 1.7 times the size of full frame. So it's a bigger jump from full frame to medium format, Fuji medium format. Medium format can be lots of different sizes, and like that's going to be one thing that you're going to hear as you look into it a lot more, is that like, oh, well, phase one medium format is a totally different medium format. It just basically, the term medium format means anything bigger than full frame. But if we're talking about Fuji full medium format, it's 1.7 size times the size of full frame. So it is a bigger jump from full frame to Fuji medium format than APS-C is to full frame.
Yeah, the exact sizes of 43.8 millimeters by 32.9 millimeters.
Right.
Which is 35 millimeter is full frame, so you can kind of get a feeling.
Right, and it's
for how much larger it is.
16-bit raw files that this is going to shoot. So, like, you are the color information and just the actual information that you're getting off of this sensor is kind of unreal. And I'm deep diving in on some of the research with this and looking at images and stuff. You can really see it, especially with the landscape images, like the gradation in color and the shifts and everything. There was kind of this weird trend when the R4 came out that like medium format has come to full frame, or like it might as well be a medium format camera at 61 megapixels. But I think if you actually look at the files, and you're not looking at them one-to-one next to each other, but actually just look at some of the files and see the color and the dynamic range, you're gonna be like, well, it's a bit of a different world. So I think what I'm curious about, like, is has Fuji kind of brought this down into the mainstream enough that it's gonna start changing the industry towards where Sony, I don't know about Canon, Nikon. Like, it's been rumored for a long time that Sony has medium format, at least worked on it, right? So, like, is this going to be a watershed moment where medium format becomes something that is more common and readily available and more mainstream, for lack of a better word?
Oh yeah, I mean, when we were first getting interested in photography and stuff, quite a while ago now, like the early 2010s, medium format was like full frame was the god camera kind of, and medium format was the mythical camera, like beyond what you could imagine. Like, we're talking about Hasselblads that are $40,000. I may be a little inaccurate with my pricing there, but like,
or phase ones that are $60,000 or whatever.
Just like the idea of a camera with a sensor that big, and the resolutions even back then were crazy high. Kind of just, you don't even think about it. You wouldn't even think about it because you're going to have to be 20 years into a very successful career to own a camera like that. So you just don't think about it. But now we're talking about a camera that costs maybe give or take $500, the same as a 1DX line or this Sony A1. It's $500 cheaper than that camera.
Right. It's cheaper than the A1.
And doubles the megapixels. It's twice the megapixels.
Right. And it does so at with, the pixels are bigger. So, I don't know how that all adds the math. I'm not going to figure that all out. But the like, if you have a 100 megapixel full frame sensor, like, those pixels are small. right? You know, they're getting smaller and smaller, whereas you have larger pixels on this 100 megapixel medium format camera.
Which is going to help preserve low light performance.
Right.
And color integrity,
Right.
etc.
Yep.
I think it's really exciting. I think in the end, $6,000 is a little beyond industry takeover.
Right.
Price.
I'm saying, is this a first step? And obviously, it's selling very well. Like, people are adopting it. And also, interestingly enough, the lenses are very good. The Fuji GF lenses are very, like, everything that I can see, like, optically perfect keeps coming up, like, in researching these lenses. And they are not much more than full frame. Honestly, they're on par with full frame. Like the 45 to 100, which is the kind of 24 to 70 equivalent. It's not quite as wide as 24-70. It's actually like 35 to 80, which is kind of a different focal range. But it's the same as Canon and Sony's and Nikon's 24-70s. Like, it's the same price. And you know, it's f4 constant, which comes out to 3.5 to 3 in f-stop.
Yeah, actually, I have the conversion here, but yeah, it's very similar.
It's, you know, it comes out being very similar.
It's an F3.
F3, okay. So
very similar to F2.8.
Yeah, very similar to F2.8. Yeah, very close. So I just find this an interesting, and you know, it's a bigger lens than those lenses, but not outrageously so. And this camera being the same size as an S1R, which I've held and used, and actually really liked that camera for landscape photography. Like, as far as just like holding a camera, like, I haven't held a camera that was like, okay, yeah, this is going to hold up to whatever I put it through. Like, it had its own issues. But it was a great system, and it seems like Fuji is bringing the heat with it, and they have a significantly larger library of lenses than I would have ever thought for the GFX line. They've got some great primes. They just released a 80 millimeter 1.7, which is a 50. I don't know.
It's a 63 millimeter f1.3 is what it looks like.
Right. Interesting.
So we're talking about just below 1.4 on that regard. Now, exactly how the aperture translates is going to be controversial.
Yes.
There's going to be whole videos made on this. These aperture numbers I'm referencing here are purely based off of the crop factor, which I believe is
1.7.
Or it's 0.7.
Oh, right.
Because they get bigger, but there's going to be whole videos made on this. There probably already are videos made on exactly how to translate the aperture, because it doesn't quite translate 1-to-1, I'm sure.
Right. It's a kind of a different animal.
Kind of a different animal, but that's a really fast lens, and you know, you do get 1.2 from Canon, and full frame, just because of how successful full frame's been, is going to kind of have an R&D head start.
Yes,
and they're going to be able to sell lenses at a slightly cheaper price because of volume. There's a lot of things supporting full frame. So the question is if you can already do this with Fuji's current user base and expected sales, you can already get to 1.3. What does a 80 millimeter 1.2 look like? That's
right.
You know, that's in a different stratosphere of capability.
Right.
And you know, it's you know, this is just like comparing APS-C to full frame. There are things you can always do to help APS-C compete better, but you can apply the exact same logic to full frame. And you get the advantage of full frame back.
Right.
So like an example of this would be using an f2.8 zoom on APS-C, which is actually hard to get because they don't make very many of those. But if you use a 2.8 zoom on an APS-C camera, you basically have an f4 zoom on a full frame camera.
Right.
But you can put an f2.8 zoom on a full frame camera. So it's really exciting to see as Fuji continues to flesh out this lineup, what they're going to be able to do, and possibly even other companies in the future.
Right. I predict that Sony will get in on this, especially with how successful. They're probably looking at Fuji very carefully right now. Because I think in a lot of ways, Fuji is not a brand I have known much at all about. So I've kind of looked into it a lot over the last few weeks after this camera was announced. It's just not, I knew the X-T4 was a thing. I knew the X-T3 was a thing. I knew it was good for color. It's better for color than I was thinking. I've actually downloaded RAW files and worked with them and kind of been blown away. And that's with both medium format and their X series, which is the APS-C. And I think that Fuji is an interesting company, what they're trying to do, because they have these two lines. And one is the X line, which is APS-C, and then the GFX, which is the medium format. And the X line is, all about, size, weight, portability, still maximizing. It's kind of maxing out APS-C is kind of what it feels like. Doing the most you can possibly squeeze out of APS-C. Fuji's probably doing it on the X line. And then they're leaning into what you're getting on the GFX line, which is image quality, on another level. And they're doing things like, making the GFX 100S super weather sealed and durable, right? It's not I think medium format cameras have kind of gotten this reputation for being I wouldn't use that as a landscape camera because it's super fragile, super expensive. But
and it's
I think
super big and heavy.
It's super big and heavy.
In the past.
Right. But that's not this camera. And it uses the same battery as the X-T4. So you kind of have this juxtaposition of these two systems that are I think they're being kind of leveraged to their maximum potential. So it's a smart move. I don't think that Canon and Nikon are leveraging APS-C in only a value perspective. And Sony. Did I say Sony? Whichever.
Sony's doing a better job than, we have to be fair, Sony's doing a better job with APS-C than I think Canon and Nikon are doing at this point.
Yes.
At least from a lens perspective. They actually have a new clean 16 to 55 2.8 and
right.
A few primes and stuff, although Sony has been deeply neglecting their APS-C lineup for a long time, as they all have been.
That's what I'm saying, though, is I think that they look at it mainly as their value line. This is our value line, and that's not how Fuji is looking at their X line. It's not their value line, it's this is our smaller, lighter, and they're still super weather sealed, super durable, and premium feeling. So I think that's an interesting, I'd like to see what Canon would do with that. They have in the past, the 7D series. That's one of the first cameras I had and used, and I loved that camera. I don't know that I've actually, loved a camera as much since, getting that camera, was a huge deal for me. Getting an original 7D. And it was so durable and it was had the same body design as a 5D and all that stuff. Loved it. And then the D500.
But what Fuji's doing is they're backing up. They're backing up good camera bodies, which all the camera companies have done good APS-C camera bodies. Right. They're backing up good camera bodies with good lenses.
That is true.
APS-C.
That is true.
The 50 millimeter f1.0, all of their tiny little 2.8 and 1.7.
16 to 55, 2.8.
Primes and
50 to 140, 2.8.
They're the only camera company that has a 70 to 200, a high-end 70 to 200 equivalent lens. It is going to be more like f4 on full frame. With the translations.
However that works,
However that works. But they're the only ones that have done it. And all the other camera companies have just not taken the lens side seriously. And that's because they want you to get the full frame camera and the full frame lenses and move through their full frame lineup. So it doesn't really make sense for them to do it. The only reason it makes sense for Fuji is they don't have full frame to send you to.
Right, exactly. But now they have medium format. And I think they're not designing these systems to compete with one another. I think they're designing them to kind of work with one another. They kind of cover each other's and fill each other's gaps in an interesting way. So anyway, I think it's going to be really interesting to see where this medium format thing goes. And I also we kind of moved into this kind of somewhat unintentionally, but I also would like to see Canon, Nikon, Sony treat their APS-C lines with a little more respect. I think there's more to be squeezed out of there than what they're doing. Like I think there's right now it's just kind of the assumption is that the future is full frame, and I think that's going to be true to a certain degree, right?
Well, there are rumors circulating that Canon's going to keep their EOS M line alive for at least another year. They're going to release cameras this year. We'll have to see where that goes. You could definitely make a jaw-dropping APS-C camera from Canon if they wanted to. They don't really have a great or expansive lens lineup for EOS M. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's an RF camera meant to be used with full-frame lenses, which is what normally happens with their high-end APS-C cameras. The R7, I think, is what they're thinking it may be called.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
There's rumors circulating about that, but yeah, I mean, earlier on I said that the $6,000 camera really isn't because it's that expensive, it doesn't really have the ability to make a huge dent in the camera industry. But it's easy to forget that Fuji actually has two older cameras. The GFX50R, that's the original GFX camera, and the GFX50S. And those two cameras are starting to reach down into the 3000s.
I think it's reverse of that. The 50S was their first one, and then the R is the new, smaller rangefinder one.
It is reversed.
Yeah.
You're right.
Yep.
The 50S is the 100S's forefather in that lineup. But those two cameras are starting to reach under $4,000.
Yep.
They're not that old. They still, you're missing that 100 megapixels. So you're getting the sensor size advantage, but you're not getting the resolution advantage.
Yeah.
Which is a big deal, but I could absolutely see particularly landscape photographers and portrait photographers being like, well, Fuji has some incredible cameras for me to grow into, and I really would like to set myself apart from smartphone photography and provide my clients with something that looks different and unique, that has nice colors, that I could throw the this 80 millimeter f1.7 on there and get some really good depth of field as well. Just really kind of set themselves apart and do something different than the full frame stuff. I realize that the IAF with full frame right now is incredible.
Right.
All the camera companies have incredible IAF right now, and you are kind of sacrificing that. But I think that it's now a compelling system to look at seriously.
Yeah.
Even if you don't have $6,000 to spend on a camera. And that's where the GFX50S, maybe even more particularly the GFX50R, which is a little newer and a little cheaper, those two cameras are going to give you something unique and different, and they're not going to cost you an arm and a leg. And that's never been something you could do before.
Never. Like full frame was like as big as you were going to get. And I think it makes sense like that this is the natural progression. Like you can only make pixels so small on a full frame sensor and still be able to capture data and light accurately, like color, light, all of that. Like, the A7R4's ISO is not as good as the A7R3. And I used both cameras. I used them next to each other. And in low light, you definitely felt the 61 megapixels, which is 20 more than 20 some, or close to 20 more than the R3. Maybe not exactly 20, but and I think that's just going to be, the camera, they've done an amazing job. Like as far as anyone can tell, this A1 has very good low light performance, right? I don't know whether it's the same as the A9, But, there's limits to physics. And so in order to have those pixels grow in resolution and capture data, the pixels have to get bigger. So I just think it's going to be interesting to see if this is kind of the beginning of something, or whether this is just kind of Fuji's thing and the other companies are more...
Well, I think that more and more people are going to have to actually compare, and that's going to land a lot more people in Fuji's court than before. Because with medium format, it's always been, well, I need to save up for 2 years or take out a giant loan to get into medium format. And now people's full frame systems are sellable, and you can buy medium format instead.
Yeah.
And that's going to convert people just because medium format's interesting and exciting to some degree. And these cameras look, particularly the GFX 100S, looks incredibly capable.
Yes.
And because it appears incredibly capable, and when the reviews finally come out,
it's the first medium format camera you could shoot a wedding with. Like, let's be honest. I mean, maybe the 100 you could argue, because it has really good autofocus too. But between these two cameras, like you could shoot a wedding with either of those cameras. And that's just not been like a phase 1 thing where you shoot a phase 1 wedding, right? Like, that's just not where it's been. But yeah, now you can, and people will, and they will charge more. And I think, you're going to look at it down the road and just be like, hey, I can shoot your wedding with a medium format camera. Well, what is that? Well, it means the sensor is as big as you can get. Like, your images will have better color, better dynamic range. You'll be able to print them bigger if people do that with wedding. I don't know whether they do that. I mean, maybe some people, but, it's a leg up. Like, it's a way to stand out and be like, my work is... Well, and then for all intents and purposes, like, I'm kind of trying to create medium format. Like, this image behind me was a panorama. It's a, like 115, 120 megapixel panorama, right? That I created, which is kind of to get that medium format resolution and look. Like, that was the whole point. So anyway, yeah, I think it's going to be interesting. So
yeah. It's going to be really interesting to see where that goes. And it's also going to be interesting to see... It's going to be really interesting to see what the 100R is and what price point they go for with
that
the
will be
GFX
interesting.
100R.
Yeah.
Because if you can get this camera to 4,500, that's just another... if they could get this camera to 4,500, that means that the 50R and the 50S are going to be even cheaper. They're going to be forced down in value.
Right.
Which kind of stinks if you're an owner of a 50S and a 50R. But it's going to, you might be able to, in a year or maybe a year and a half, you might be able to get a medium format camera for under $3,000 or right at $3,000. And that's really game changing, because that's like 5D money and you're getting a medium format camera. Right. It won't be the top of the line medium format camera.
Right. But it's going to trickle down, and it's going to start, like, I think what this does, what the 100S does, is it starts putting pressure on the top end of the full frame industry. So, like, if you were someone who looks at an A7 and an A1, right? And especially if you're a landscape portrait photographer, how can you not look at the 100S? Like, I mean, if you're a wildlife photographer, then don't. Don't waste your time. But if you are a wedding portrait photographer, you should look at it. Like, at least look at it. And I think that's just going to continue. It's going to keep putting pressure down on full frame more and more.
And it kind of makes sense. I mean, here's the thing about the A1. Image quality is amazing. It is.
Yes.
It's got 50 megapixels. That's awesome. But you're paying $6,500 for 50 megapixels, and you can pay about $1,000 for 42 megapixels. Now, totally different cameras.
Right.
But also completely different price points, and the true resolution between the A7R2 and the A1 are very similar.
Yeah.
So when you think about being someone whose focus is image quality, which is a lot of photographers, not every photographer, a lot of the time it really is the autofocus.
Yeah.
You're trying to balance autofocus with frames per second, with all these different things. And smaller sensors have always had advantages in those arenas as photography as technology marches forward. They kind of get a lot of that stuff first.
Right.
But as if you're looking to spend that much money, there kind of hasn't been a camera at that price point that's like, let me give you twice the megapixels,
right,
as what those cameras are shooting. And if your focus is image quality, not autofocus heavy shoots, it's image quality first and foremost.
Right.
There's now a pro camera at that $6,000 price point that gives you image quality first. And usability being something that's still present. It's still a usable camera. It shoots
the
video.
autofocus is functional. The autofocus is good.
And it has some of those missing links that it really needs. A large sensor, high resolution sensor needs stabilization to be usable.
Yep.
Handheld.
Right.
And it has those two things. And that's just going to get better as I don't know, maybe they'll do a 150S, but my kind of guess is we're going to get Mark IIs of all of these cameras.
Yes, I would agree.
I think 100 was kind of what they were going for. When they launched the 50 and the 50S and the 50R.
Right.
I think 100 was probably the plan.
Well, and at the time when those came out, like the 50S came out in
17, January 19th, 2017.
Okay, so 4 years ago. And 50 megapixels was a big deal. I mean, the R2 is out, the R3 was out,
the 5DSR was out,
the D850 was out, the 5DSR, yeah.
But
so yeah,
the Sony cameras have really good image quality at their 40 megapixels. The 5DSR though actually had some image quality issues. It
did terrible dynamic range,
and not great low light performance. So you do get kind of those, let's say, the image flexibility while maintaining a high resolution. That's what medium format offers.
Yep.
Whereas like full frame can give you a really high resolution image, but you may have to do some trade-offs. It's the same thing that happens with Micro Four Thirds or APS-C. Eventually you're just pushing the tech up gets harder, and it just gets easier to make the sensor bigger, to get those advantages. But that doesn't mean that there's not very many people thinking A1 or GFX 100S. I don't really like. There's
probably not very many, but there are
people that are thinking that. But if you were getting the GFX 50, if you were getting the A1, for the image quality, because it maybe the A7R4, there's something on it you don't like. The autofocus isn't super reliable, so you just want that extra resolution over an A7R3 or something.
Right.
You may really look at this camera because it's a little cheaper. It's twice the megapixels. You're keeping a lot of really cool functionality.
Right.
It's a really exciting camera, I think.
And I think that's partly maybe why we actually made this, is because it's been a while since there's like, oh, wow, something could really change, Like, it's not just going to be stats on the back of the box. It's going to be like, a whole different way that photography works. And, I think it may wind up just kind of being Fuji's thing. And if it is, that may be great. That's great for Fuji. But I also could see this being a moment where we're like, wow, this is the moment where like Sony was like, okay, we need to take this seriously. I have never heard any rumors about Canon or Nikon doing anything with medium format. I would just kind of anticipate Sony being ahead of them on this. They were so slow to the mirrorless game that they're going to be slow to this too. If it truly is an ongoing trend, I would definitely expect to see a Sony medium format line before we see anything like that from Canon or Nikon. So unless they really are doing this under the radar and they saw this coming, but they didn't see mirrorless coming, at least not fast enough.
They didn't see it coming the way that it ended up happening. I mean, they were...
Well, I think Sony even sort of saw it coming, right? I mean, the A7 I, when it was released, like that, it was novelty. It was like, in a lot of ways, it felt like this camera, didn't it? You're like, oh, wow, it's a full frame mirrorless camera, which, mirrorless cameras were so niche then. We're like, well, this is full frame. It's the same size as the 5D. I remember thinking that when seeing it, like, wow, that's really something. But it was a niche camera at the time. And then they did the A7 II, and then the R and the R2, and then suddenly once you had the R2, people were like, oh wait, this is legit, full frame mirrorless.
Well, and expect to hear a lot of the same arguments too.
Right.
Because people are going to run into the same problems why they can't switch. People are going to run into autofocusing, or it doesn't shoot fast enough frames per second, or et cetera. Or maybe it's not reliable enough, or that's missing this lens that I need. All of those same arguments that people levied against Sony
for mirrorless, full frame mirrorless.
For full frame mirrorless, they're going to levy against this. I mean, as a matter of fact, there's a non-zero chance that there's a comment in the comment section right now of somebody being like, I could never buy a GFX 100S because of it doesn't have this lens I really want,
right?
Or it doesn't have the Canon 50mm f1.2, and as you said on the podcast, the Fuji GFX has nothing that fast.
Right.
It's it's a really interesting. It's going to be really interesting to see how the market responds. But I do think it is interesting how maybe not as big of a deal as I would have thought this camera would be, possibly just because the A1 came out, or maybe just people are like, medium format can't be that big of a deal. It's
right.
just it's really interesting.
Yeah, I think it will be, and I think as this camera starts showing up in people's hands, and they're creating things like, there's a video. I will link to it in the description. I will figure out his name. I think his name is Brian. Oh boy, here, if I get on my YouTube history, I can figure out his name. So he got to use the GFX early. He's a Fuji shooter, so that's just, take that for what you will. But he created these landscape images in Arizona, and just watching them on my TV, was with my daughter, kind of taking care of her, watching on the TV. I was like, these are incredible. His name is Brian Miner. I will link to the video, but there is something intangible about it, like with them. Like I would have picked up on it even if I didn't, because I only sort of was paying attention. This was the first video that I watched about the GFX that actually kind of woke me up to it a little bit. And I'm like, those images are really good. There's something really cool about what he's doing. And granted, he's a great photographer and he's using his tools well. And that's part of it. And you can always argue, like, you can shoot fantastic images with any modern camera. I'm not saying you're going to need for medium format in order to take great pictures. I'm never going to say that. But there is having a really powerful tool and then taking your skills to the next level is just going to create even more, great things. So anyway, I think we can kind of probably wrap up there. So
indeed.
If you enjoyed this video, we once again, we would love it if you'd give it a like and subscribe for more content like this.
Yeah.
And
I don't know if you wanted to see some photos and video about the GFX 100S, you may want to subscribe, but
yeah, maybe.
It's hard to say for sure, but thanks so much for listening. And once again, if you would also maybe leave us a review on iTunes, you can also subscribe. This is an audio first podcast. If you hadn't noticed, we haven't really been showing a bunch of stuff,
right,
anything like that.
So we are available on iTunes. I think we did mention at the beginning, but
indeed. So if you can check us out there anywhere you listen to your podcasts, including Spotify.
Ooh,
we're on Spotify now.
Yeah.
So there you go.
All right. Well, we will see you on the next adventure.
See you on the next adventure.